We now need to shift over to North Korea. And before we talk about the history, like I did previously, we kind of need to sit back and think about our attitudes towards North Korea. So you may remember earlier we were talking about the Korean War, and that period before the war, in many ways, North Korea was doing better than South Korea. There was more order. If you were someone on the political left, you were certainly going to like a lot of the reforms that were coming out. Even some people more to the right, at least until we got to land reform, might have supported some of those reforms. Right? And economically, North Korea is basically going to do better than South Korea until the later 1970s. So that's one thing we have to keep in mind. That's kind of review. Now, today, our common perceptions of North Korea are that North Korea is essentially irrational and crazy, and that North Korea is strange. What I would argue, though, is that North Korea is in fact highly rational and practical. It has been an enemy in the sense of the United States for decades, and during that time the U.S. was one of the most powerful countries in the world and is still around. A lot of people do not like North Korea. A lot of countries do not like North Korea. And it's still around despite all that opposition. Right? If the North Korean government was irrational and crazy, it would still not be able to still exist. Moreover, North Korea is very good at getting without giving. Right? North Korea is able to act in many ways a globally irresponsible way. The North Korean government is able to treat its people very poorly, and despite that, or in a sense because of that, North Korea often receives aid and assistance. Because in the end, the North Korean government has set up things in such a way that as much as we do not like their government, as much as we find it odious, the idea of a collapse, a complete collapse of the government, is also horrifying and promises to be more problematic. Right? So that's something we have to keep in mind. Do not think North Korean government is irrational and crazy. It might be strange to us, right? It might seem irrational and crazy to us. But the key thing is we have to understand this. Oftentimes when people discuss North Korea, they'll say something like, I can't believe that they allow this to happen to their people, right? And that's in this comic. Our people starve so others may be incinerated, right? North Korea, while undergoing terrible famine, while having a hard time feeding its people, chose to invest resources in nuclear weapons. There is, though, a fundamental flaw with the logic in this comic, because it assumes that the North Korean government somehow feels responsible to the North Korean people and that its primary goal is their well-being, right? And it makes sense because for Americans, we assume that our government, a government of the people, for the people, by the people, exists to take care of us. But the rationality driving the North Korean government is regime survival, right? The rationale driving the North Korean government is regime survival. Not what's good for the North Korean people, but will allow the people to stay in power to stay in power. And once you understand that goal, their actions seem a lot more rational. Now, in this section, a lot of what we're trying to do, and we'll discuss this more later on, is trying to understand how North Korea, and in some ways it's similar to China, that looks so hopeful in the early 1950s, how does it go off the rails? How does a country and a government that promises, all these good things, better wages and better conditions for workers, equality for women, how does it go so bad, right? How does it go so bad? And a lot of this section on North Korea, in addition to those objectives we talked about before, is trying to set the stage for that, to understand how it goes off the rails. Now, one thing I also tried to emphasize earlier is this idea that we tend to see things from our own perspective, right? Americans tend to think of democracy as making sense, of liberty as making sense, and as governments existing primarily to take care of the freedom, to protect the freedoms and to take care of the economic well-being of their citizens. That's the lens that we look through things at. But we have to emphasize that North Korea was not heavily influenced by a democratic tradition. The one group of people that were heavily influenced by a democratic tradition were Korean Protestant Christians. And remember, Pyongyang, the current day capital of North Korea, was the center of Korean Protestant Christianity. So we have to remember that for North Koreans, there's not much of a democratic tradition. Those Protestant Christians who had a democratic tradition, they were Presbyterians, and in the Presbyterian church, you elect your elders and you elect the ministers who take care of it, take care of your church. Those people, remember, were driven south, right? Those people were driven south. So there's not going to be an influential democratic tradition in North Korea, right? Their first influence is the Chosun dynasty, which, like I said, is not democratic in any real way. It was a monarchy. Remember, way, way, way back to the beginning of this course, status and hierarchy were very important in the Chosun dynasty. Ideas of equality seemed odd and, in fact, dangerous, right? Hierarchy brings harmony, but if everyone's equal, how do we know who gets to decide what we should do? So it seemed that equality would bring chaos. In the Chosun dynasty, there was a distinct lack of social mobility. It was very hard to rise up in status. Remember, the civil service exams were not a way to allow people to rise up in status. They were a way for the people, the Yangban, who are already high up in status, to maintain that status. That looks a lot like North Korea today, right? Where you essentially have a monarchical government, no democracy, where status and hierarchy are very important, and it's almost impossible to change your mobility. It's hard to go up in society. So we shouldn't be surprised that there are continuities there. During the Japanese colonial period, which is what Kim Il-sung had been fighting against, right? The guy who becomes the first leader of North Korea, much remains the same, right? You still, North Koreans are, all Koreans are not exposed really to democracy. They're not allowed to vote really. Instead, they're told what to do by the government, which is ultimately governed by an emperor. And in the Japanese colonial period, they were exposed to this emperor-based nationalism we talked about in a previous section. And remember how in that previous section, we talked about how there was this idea that Japanese formed a pure and virtuous race who by their very nature as Japanese people were better than other people? Just change Japanese to Korean and you understand the North Korean ideology. We North Koreans are a pure, or actually all Koreans, it's just the North are free from the North Korean perspective. All Koreans are part of a pure, virtuous race. They got that from the Japanese in a sense. And in the Japanese colonial period, the leader was worshipped as a god, right? The Japanese emperor was worshipped as a god. So they borrow that idea and apply it to Kim Il-sung. Strangely, communism is not that important. In many ways, if you want to understand North Korea, it's better to think of fascism, especially that of Nazi Germany. And I'm not trying to be flippant here, so please bear with me. But imagine if Adolf Hitler had succeeded in his goal to completely destroy Jewish people, right? Remember, Adolf Hitler in the Holocaust had sought to destroy all Jewish people so that you would have this kind of single Aryan people in Germany. Imagine if that had been successful. That's kind of how North Korea sees itself in its country. It's this pure place where these pure, virtuous Korean people live. That's not a communist ideology. Communists are not particularly interested in race. They focus more on class, economic class. And so while communism does have some influence on North Korea in terms, especially in the early history, that influence is mostly gone. What's interesting and also I find frustrating in terms of translation, the North Korean constitution says nothing about communism anymore. Pictures of Karl Marx have been taken down. And oftentimes, for example, there's a wonderful documentary you should see called State of Mind. Awesome documentary about Korean mass games, North Korean mass games. But in that video, they consistently mistranslate the word socialism as communism, and those are different concepts. Communism is a type of socialism, but not all types of socialism are communist. So North Korea does follow socialism, but it's our kind of socialism. It's North Korean socialism. And we have to remember that the Nazis followed what they called National Socialism. So when you think of North Korea, I think of 1930s Japan, and to a certain extent, think about Nazi Germany as if it had been successful in its attempt to eliminate Jews and other people who were so-called considered undesirable. And that can help you to better understand the trajectory of North Korean history. But in a sense, we're not there yet, right? We're not there yet. The late 1940s in North Korea were a hopeful time, right? No one saw this coming, right? The horrors of the current regime ruling North Korea. There was a lot of hope in North Korea, both in terms of realizing the communist dream of freedom and equality and enough resources for everyone, and national unification. The Korean War ends in a draw from the perspective of the war between North and South Korea. China and Japan, as I said earlier, I think are the victors. But Korea remains divided, right? Korea remains divided. And North Korea will follow this dual dream of trying to make a communist society and of trying to achieve national unification. Now, one reasonable thing you could ask yourself is, how is Kim Il-sung able to survive the disastrous Korean War? Remember, the Korean War was supposed to be a short war in which the North Koreans would quickly unify all of Korea before the United States and the United Nations could become involved. As we discussed previously, that failed miserably. And the North Korean government was almost completely destroyed. If it wasn't for China's intervention, it would have been destroyed. Do you remember, though, how I stressed how North Korean soldiers were told that they were counterattacking, that the South had launched the invasion first, and the North was just responding? While completely dishonest and false, that turned out to be a pretty good strategy, because what Kim Il-sung said was not, oh, I messed up and we lost the war. He said, actually, we won the war because the South Korean puppet government, under the control of the United States, they attacked us and we succeeded in defending North Korea, so at least part of Korea is free. I mean, it's just a bold-faced lie, of course. I mean, and he knew it, right? I mean, he presented his defeat and his disastrous leadership as the victorious defense of Korea against Western aggression, right? He said, actually, the South Koreans attacked us first, led by the puppeteers, the United States, which is pulling the strings for that puppet South Korean government, and we defeated them, see? So I am actually a great hero. And the Americans stay in South Korea. And Kim Il-sung says, look, guess what? They might attack again. So we need to fortify our country. And since I'm the one who defeated them the first time, I need to stay in charge, right? I'm the one that needs to stay in charge. There were opponents to Kim Il-sung who knew that he was wrong, that he was lying. There were Chinese-educated North Koreans. There were North Koreans who had been in China and learned about Chinese-style communism. There were Russian-educated North Koreans. And there were Korean communists from South Korea. Kim Il-sung, terrible leader in many ways, is a wily politician, and he will successfully eliminate all opposition, making sure that the people on top that control the North Korean government are his buddies from the days where he was a guerrilla soldier. So what's going to happen in North Korea is that the people who rise to power are the guerrillas led by Kim Il-sung. So there's no one to really disagree There's no one who can offer an alternate vision of what things should look like. It's Kim Il-sung and his guerrillas. And remember how I critiqued the Japanese leadership in the 1930s? I said, they're governed by these soldiers whose answer to everything is military. Well, guess what? Kim Il-sung, whose fame is as a guerrilla soldier, in many ways he didn't actually understand that much about communism, but his major fame was as an anti-Japanese guerrilla soldier. He's going to try and follow military means primarily. His focus is the military. And now he has no one to oppose him and can kind of do what he wants. Now, what does the North Korean government essentially promise its people? First of all, that it will preserve and defend the purity and survival of the Korean race. Right? It's an ultra-nationalist government. As part of that duty, it needs to unify the Korean Peninsula. That will probably have to be done violently because of the Americans who are preventing the South Koreans from trying to unify with us. Because according to North Korea during this time period, in the 50s, 60s, and the 70s, the Korean people in the South want to be part of North Korea, but the Americans will not let them. Right? The American-supported South Korean, Republic of Korean puppet government will not allow the South Koreans to unify with the North as much as they want. If our troops would just leave, immediately South Korea would unify with North Korea. They're not going to leave, though, so we're probably going to have to attack them and achieve unification violently when the time is right. All North Koreans should work for the state, and in return will be given a basic living through what's called the public distribution system. North Korea, of all communist countries, and it is fair in the 1950s and 60s to call it a communist country, not fair to call it now a communist country. Don't think that's accurate. It got the closest of all communist countries to actually eliminating the market and eliminating currency. Right? It was the one that was most able to control the economy and distribute to people a basic living through rationing. And to give you a quote of what this public distribution system was aiming at and what the promises made to the Korean people were in the North, was that they would be able to eat boiled rice and meat soup, dress in silk, and live in houses with tile roofs. This is much more modest than what the Chinese government had promised. I should point out, it seems very similar to the old traditional one. Remember where I said that you had to, the job of the emperor to see if they had the mandate of heaven was if you had enough food to eat, clothes to wear, and a good place to live. That's basically all Kim Il-sung is promising. However, this is actually a pretty big promise. North Korea, especially after it suffered the devastation of the Korean War, is not at this point yet. So while this seems like a very limited promise to us, for North Koreans, this sounded like a pretty good deal. Now, how are you going to achieve this? Right? How are you going to achieve these government promises, which essentially are nationalism, preserve the Korean nation, unify the Korean nation under the rulership of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and bringing economic development? How are we going to build a strong army that can defend our country and unify the Korean Peninsula and to keep our economic promises? Well, one thing that the North Korean government will do is effectively mobilize its population to rebuild industry. They will mobilize mass groups of workers, similar to what was done in China, to do things like build dams, build reservoirs, build irrigation works, that kind of thing. And I want to stress, that works well. Mobilizing your population to try and make like steel does not work very well. But digging ditches, that's something a lot of people can do very effectively. And this actually does help North Korea develop or recover and then develop quickly. They're able to effectively mobilize their population to do things like engage in these infrastructure projects, and it works well. And in fact, industrial output will recover more quickly from the Korean War in North Korea than it does from South Korea. And what's really astounding, I won't talk too much about this when we talk about South Korea, but the fact is South Korea was heavily dependent on American aid, and we were often able to influence South Korean government policies by threatening to cut off their aid. In 1954, just a year after the Korean War ended, about 1/3 of North Korean government revenue was from foreign aid, but by 1960 it was only 2.6%. Now, they received some aid in other ways, but the fact was North Korea was doing a better job standing on its own than South Korea. So I want to stress again, in the 50s, North Korea is engaging in economic recovery and development. And when you compare this to other countries in the world that were underdeveloped, this was pretty good, right? This powerful North Korean state is able to mobilize people and bring economic development pretty effectively. Now, what, though, did this economic development focus on? Well, remember, you have a nationalist regime led by a former guerrilla soldier, Kim Il-sung, pictured there, with his guerrilla soldier buddies, his old comrades, who want to achieve unification through military means, and who just experienced a war where they suffered a great deal. They naturally want to build up their military. And if you want a strong military, you have to have heavy industry. So they tend to emphasize heavy industry, and heavy industry is things like making steel and producing military goods. Little attention was given to consumer goods. And in fact, they hadn't made much promise to give much in terms of consumer goods, but they are focusing their industrial might on heavy industry and the military, with the understanding that once Korea is all united, then they could produce consumer goods. So their goals, in a sense, this kind of review again, just to make this clear, they want to defend North Korea. They remember what it's like to be colonized. They remember what it's like to be devastated by war. So they never want that to happen again. So they need a strong military. They also want to unify the peninsula. You need a strong military for that. Like I said, people who are diplomats tend to think to solve problems diplomatically. People who are soldiers tend to think about how to solve problems militarily. This is a government dominated by guerrillas, so we should not be surprised that their focuses tend to be military. Now, agriculturally, North Korea is rather different from China. China, remember, is a huge country in which there are areas that are very, very fertile and able to produce a lot of food. In Korea, a very small country, equivalent to about a Chinese province, most of the good agricultural land was in southern Korea. North Korea did not have particularly good agricultural land. So North Korea was an agriculturally poor country to begin with. Now, and I'm again sad to say this, but we see a repeat. Remember how we talked about how North Korea gained the support of the peasants through land reform? Well, guess what? They will take the land back. They will focus, like China, on collectivization. That will start in 1953. By 1956, they'll claim that 40% of farmers are part of collectives in which they have given up their land to the collective and work it basically as laborers. And the North Korean government will claim that all farms have been collectivized by 1958. This allows the state to control farmers, much as it did it and what they produce, right, to get direct access to the grain and put it where they want it to go, which is to the cities to feed the workers who are building machines to use in war, and also to feed soldiers. But productivity will decline, right? This is not, in the end, you don't work as hard as a paid, basically as a wage earner, as you would if you got to keep the products that you were growing yourself, right? Farmers farming when they get to keep the surplus food tend to work harder than farmers or than agricultural laborers who are just paid for the day or however. In addition, there are some problems in that agricultural labor is often pulled for building projects and industrialization. We saw that in the Great Leap Forward in China, right? Where agricultural labor was being pulled away to work on those backyard furnaces. However, one thing I want to emphasize is that North Korea during this time period never goes as far as China in the Great Leap Forward. They will use similar means, but they never push them so far and in such a, flat illogical direction as what will happen in China. So this does not, during this time period, cause massive starvation like you had in China. Instead, what North Koreans did was they made up for these problems by importing technology and especially by becoming reliant on chemical fertilizer, right? So the North Korea will avoid mass famines. The North Koreans won't get a huge amount to eat, but they do get food to eat, because their productivity will be made up by things like chemical fertilizers and tractors and things like that. And one thing I really have to emphasize, as bad as all this sounds, and this is something we have to keep in mind, this was better than what Koreans were facing in the colonial period, right? This was better than what Koreans were facing in the colonial period, right? So this sounds bad to us. And of course, if you're a peasant, you're angry about losing your land. I mean, that's why you supported these guys in the first place, right? Because they promised you land. However, I have to emphasize, all that aside, this is better than living in a sense, in many ways, in colonial Korea in the 20s and 30s, and definitely better than in the 40s. So this does represent an improvement. So thus far, I've been talking about basically from 1953 through the 1960s. In many ways, what was going on there in North Korea doesn't seem particularly dangerous, right? Notice I haven't talked about anything like the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution, right? North Korea will avoid the excesses of Chinese communism, right? Ultimately, the North Korean system will encourage order rather than revolution. So in many ways, during this time period, it seems like, if you have the choice of living in China in the 50s and 60s or North Korea in the 50s and 60s after the Korean War, North Korea might actually be better. You're more likely to be safe there because of this emphasis on order and this avoiding of the excesses of what we saw in Chinese communism. However, there's kind of a danger lurking there. The agricultural and economic issues, the emphasis on the military, that theoretically could be fixed through reform, right? So what I mean by is this. If you just focus on the military, the problem is your economy doesn't develop, and eventually your military will fall behind. You have to have a rich country before you can build a strong army. Now, that's a problem, but that can be developed through reform. What ultimately destroys the ability for North Korea to reform when times change is what's going to happen in the 1970s. Earlier, I talked about how Kim Il-sung had purged most of his enemies, right? He now, in the 1970s, wants to cement power, right? It's not clear why he decides that this needs to be done in the 1970s, but there's this focus on cementing power. Part of it's just self-interest. People like power. People want to stay in power. People want to pass that power that they have on to others. He will pass it on to his son, Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un, the current leader. But he also seems to have believed, like many dictators, that he was absolutely necessary and that North Korea could not exist without him, and that unification certainly couldn't happen without him, and that he had a destiny to unify North Korea. So in order to achieve that, he needed all power to be in his hands. And to give you a sense of how he's extending control, we have in 1974 the issuing of what are called, this is what it's called, this is the English translation, the 10 Principles for the Establishment of the Monolithic System. And all these principles have to do with how awesome Kim Il-sung is and how he is absolutely necessary to keep the country together. And I have one here just to quote. Number 4, item 4, we must make great leader Comrade Kim Il-sung's revolutionary ideology our faith and his instructions our creed. Right? So Kim Il-sung is being treated, it is a sense, as a prophet, as an almost divine figure. And what happens then is all of North Korea is going to be focused on him and his family, right? It's ultimately going to be focused on him and his family. History, culture, everything has to be about him. You want to write a song? It's got to somehow connect to him and his ideas or his family. You want to make a movie? Well, it's got to be connected to his policies in some way. Preferably, it should be about him. And this is kind of one of the fundamental problems, in a sense, tragedies, is that North Korea gets so good at stability based around this system of Kim worship, essentially, that they're not able to change, right? China, because of all the excesses, because of the problems of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese Communist Party will bring about massive reforms that will fix their system and put their country on the road to the current prosperity and economic growth that they're enjoying, at least at the time of this video is being recorded. But North Korea, because of this monolithic system based around the great leader, is not able to change, right? Is not able to change. And that, in a sense, is a great tragedy. So you maybe would want to live in North Korea in the 50s and 60s relative to China, but in the 1990s and the 2000s, you want to live in China, right? China's going to be able to reform in a sense because of how the system was discredited by the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. That will be, first of all, those excesses did not exist in North Korea, and the fundamental problems that it faces cannot be changed because Kim Il-sung has successfully eliminated anyone from whom change could come. And there comes to be developed around Kim Il-sung, pictured there in the center, a cult of personality. And you can see his son, Kim Jong-il, standing next to him. And there's this emphasis on him as the center of everything. And one thing I think is fascinating about it is how often he is pictured with children, right? And this is kind of a curious way to be presented. But the idea here is that the children represent the Korean people. We are a pure and virtuous child race living in a hostile world, and only our great leader can protect us from this dangerous and hostile world. After all, he protected us during the Korean War. And even though the United States, this very powerful country, has been threatening us, they haven't invaded us. Remember, the best kind of propaganda is the one that has a grain of truth in it. Now, this propaganda is highly problematic in many ways, right? For one reason, treating Koreans as if they're children. But the idea is this. North Koreans are taught that they live in a hostile world. That's very easy to believe because all they have to do is go look at the bomb craters left by the American bombing in the 50s. Of course, we have talked about in this class how Korea was colonized by Japan, how Japan invaded in the 1590s, and how even China has infringed on Korea's sovereignty. So it's not a hard thing for North Korean people to believe this, right? It's not a hard thing for them to believe. But again, this prevents reform. How can you improve on perfection? And Kim Il-sung, wow, is that guy perfect? According to North Korea, he is. So what is life like for North Koreans? And you could reasonably say to me, well, wait a second. You said that that any group that would be able to reform has been eliminated, but what about the people, right? So what if Kim Il-sung eliminated these other people? What about the North Korean people? Well, there's a system of control meant to stop them from being able to bring any kind of challenge of reform. First of all, what's interesting in North Korea is that there is a three-way division into hereditary classes. And your class is based essentially on what your parents were doing when either liberation or the Korean War happened. So if your family is descended from farmers, if your family is descended from workers, you have a good class background, you're part of the elite, you'll be well treated. If your grandfather was a Christian minister, if you had like an uncle that was a Buddhist monk, if you had a great-grandfather who was a member of the police during the colonial period, you were bad, right? There's these three hereditary classes. These were what was called the trusted class in a sense, the wavering class that they weren't sure if they could trust, and the hostile class. And what class you were assigned to, and like I said, this is hereditary, was determined by your family background, what maybe your great-grandfather or grandfather were doing. Were they a pro-Japanese police officer? You're in trouble. Were they a farmer or a worker? Were they a communist leader? You're good to go. And so what happens is this determines a lot about your life. It determines where you go to school, determines what job you're assigned. And guess what? You might think the elites are given the best job and the best education. So what happens then? The elite people, the ones who are, of course, most able to reform or to rebel, are very much a part of the system and are rewarded by the system. So they don't much want to change it. Remember way, way long time ago when we talked about the Meiji Restoration and how those Japanese samurai, the lower samurai, were willing to change the system because they didn't profit from it. But the Chinese and Korean elites did not want to change the Confucian system because that would mean changing the system they profited from. Well, the elites of North Korea don't want to change the system because they're rewarded by it. So those are the people that are not going to rebel. Resources tend to go to them, and they often live very comfortable lives, especially beginning in the 1980s. In addition, in North Korea, everyone was expected, somewhat broken down now, to be part of some kind of association. So there was like workers' associations, farmers' associations, young people's associations. There was a housewives' associations, and you had to go to like meetings, sometimes every week, even more, in which you had to report on what you had done. You were given information. You were told what you had to do. And this way the government kept track of people and kept them under control because, wow, could you get in a lot of trouble if you didn't come to the meeting? North Koreans did not have much of a private life. The government officials, government police could come into your house even in the middle of the night and inspect your house to make sure that you didn't have anything you weren't supposed to have. You were not allowed to travel without permission. And this means just like visiting relatives, you had to get permission to do that. Again, if you wanted to spend the night someplace other than your house, you had to register with the local official who was in charge of that area. So, and this includes spending the night, like you want to go visit your cousin, you want to spend the night at your uncle's, you got to register. And there was almost no private life, right? Life was very public. And this is one reason why North Korea destroyed religious organizations, because that was a place outside the government. They didn't like that. Mass media and popular culture were focused on the party, especially on Kim Il-sung and his great deeds. So there would be movies and things, but they would be things that glorified the leader. North Koreans, especially those living in the capital, might have access to radio or later on television. But the radios, you couldn't change the station. It was just the government station, and it's the same for the TVs. And North Korean people, as much as possible, were and are kept in isolation. They really don't know what's going on in large parts of the world and are just not up to date. That's breaking down thanks to new forms of technology that they have access to, like USB drives that have like South Korean news shows on them and dramas. But especially in this time period before the internet, they're really isolated from knowledge about the outside world. So any kind of idea that could challenge North Korea, that could lead to reform or revolution, they're just not going to get to. And of course, if you break these rules, if you try and reform or change things, you might have to go to a prison camp and do forced labor, or you might be executed. Right? So the North Korean government is able to control the lives of its people, isolate them. It rewards the most powerful so that they will support the government, and those who might resist are easily found out and punished. Moreover, we have to understand that the North Korean people often accepted this. It does make sense to say that North Korea is under threat, and because it's under threat, as a military necessity, we have to put up with certain restrictions on our freedom. And remember, North Koreans didn't have a well-developed concept of freedom because they did not have a democratic tradition. So they accept a lot of this as a military necessity. The Americans and their puppet South Korean allies might invade at any time. We have to be ready. And it fits with the ideology, right? They've been told to trust the government, to trust the leader, and all this makes sense. We're just doing what the leader's telling us to, and after all, we might get invaded. And didn't he protect us before? And one thing I really have to again stress is even into the 1970s, North Korea was economically developing and in some important ways was doing better than South Korea. And people would write articles who visited North and South Korea saying, yeah, North Korea is doing better. It's more orderly. Wealth is more equally distributed. There's not as much like rioting or anything like that. There's not as much crime. North Korea is doing better than South Korea in many respects. And that's one reason why North Koreans are willing to put up with this. That, of course, will change in the sense that they won't be doing well economically now, but they still have to put up with it. So in review then, by the late 1970s, Communist China and North Korea had succeeded in obtaining national independence. Korea is divided, but it's no longer a colony, and there's hopes that they will be able to unify. Communist China, wow, people have to take seriously. So that's a success. They offered varying degrees of economic development. There were periods of economic development in China. In many ways, North Korea was actually doing better because they didn't have the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. But there was some real economic development in both countries, I think more so in North Korea. Not as much as they wanted, though, in China, but North Korea was doing fairly well, especially by the standards they set themselves. Both, however, had failed to protect basic freedoms. Right? And in a sense, we have to remember that that is something that communism promised. Communism promised that you would get freedom. It's not able at this point to deliver that. Right? So the record is mixed. And we could say this about any country. I'm not trying to pick on them in particular. But remember that part of our objectives was to understand what they were trying to do and how well they accomplished it. So they did great in terms of obtaining national independence. That worked. They offered varying degrees of economic development. North Korea seems to have done better than China in this perspective. However, neither one had even really bothered to try and protect freedoms that might seem basic to us today.